So if these symptoms is something that we have in order to help ourselves get rid of the disease, so it's an adaptation of our own bodies to help rid of the disease, then it probably doesn't make sense to suppress this symptom. But if, on the other hand, the symptom is a manipulation of the pathogen may be causing us a fever so that it can grow better inside our bodies, then in that case, it probably makes sense to treat this symptom. And the third possibility is that it may not be an adaptation of either the pathogen or of our own bodies, but it may just simply be a side effect of the interaction of the two. So let's consider the possibility that fever is actually an adaptation of the individual who is infected. Now, studying fever is not always that easy because in organisms like ourselves, we are able to control our own body temperature internally. So if we take some medicine to suppress the temperature, this medicine is going to have some side effects. And so it's difficult to distinguish what is the cause of the change. Is it the suppression of the fever or the side effects of the medication? But it turns out that other organisms other than mammals or warm-blooded organisms like ourselves also develop a fever. And an example of those are, for instance, these desert iguanas, which are organisms that do not control their temperature internally, but they take the temperature from the environment. And so they move about the environment to give the temperature that is more appropriate for them. And it turned out that when these animals are infected by a bacteria, for instance, they warm up in the sun and give themselves a fever. And so we can see here in this study, the investigators took advantage of this fact that by controlling the temperature in the environment, they could control the temperature of the lizards without giving them any kind of medication, whether a fever is actually something that benefits the lizards in terms of helping them eliminate the disease. So they divided the lizards in different groups. Some of them, they allow them to develop a fever by giving them a warm temperature, while they maintain other lizards at their normal temperature, or some other lizards, they put them in actually colder temperature than their normal temperature. And what they found is that those individuals that were able to warm themselves up to develop a fever had a much greater survival probability than those that were too cold or at their normal temperature. So here we're seeing just the percent survival of individuals depending on their temperature. So this is very good evidence that at least in these lizards, a higher than normal temperature is actually helping them fight the disease. Now there is some evidence also in humans that suppressing a fever or suppressing the symptoms of some of these infectious diseases may actually do more harm than good. Now, the studies in humans, unfortunately, are not really conclusive, and there aren't enough of them. So I think we still have a lot of work to do in trying to figure out to what extent fever and other of these kinds of symptoms may be beneficial for us or not. But here is one of the studies that seems to be one of the nicer ones, where they had a group of volunteers infected with the cold virus. And some of these volunteers were given ibuprofen, others were given aspirin, others Tylenol, and then others were simply given a placebo. And one of the things that they looked is the extent to which they were congested in these 4 treatment groups. And what they found is that those individuals that had taken one of these 3 medications actually had greater nasal congestion than those that had taken a placebo. So it seems that in this case, these medications are actually making this more difficult for these individuals to get rid themselves of the disease. Now, we are not trying to say that fevers should not be ever suppressed, because it's clearly that there are circumstances in which the fever should be controlled. But we also should consider that there may be circumstances under which it is better just to let our bodies do their own job of helping us rid of our infections. There is evidence from other kinds of symptoms also that the symptoms that we develop are actually helping us get rid of the disease. And another example of this is iron withholding. When we become infected with the pathogen, our bodies release a chemical that causes iron to be withheld from our blood. And when a physician sees this, a physician may be tempted to say, oh, this person has anemia, perhaps I should give this person an iron supplement to improve the anemia so that perhaps they can get better with their disease. But it turns out that iron is something that bacteria need for their growth and reproduction. And the fact that iron is being withheld from our bodies is probably an adaptation to prevent bacteria from getting this resource that they need, and therefore it's a mechanism to help us get rid of the bacteria. So prescribing iron supplements under these circumstances is probably going to be doing more harm than good. So these are just two examples of how thinking like an evolutionary biologist is going to make us think twice before we decide to inhale a whole bottle of NyQuil when we have a cold or a flu, and consider whether perhaps the symptoms that we have is something that may actually be good for us, beneficial for us, and something that may be helping us get rid of a disease. So hopefully after this talk, next time you start coughing or sneezing or develop a fever, you are going to think twice whether it makes sense or not to suppress that symptom. So let's move on now to the second topic, where we are going to talk about how evolution by natural selection happens. And evolution by natural selection is important because that is the mechanism by which adaptations evolve. So adaptations like fever in animals, or adaptations like antibiotic resistance in bacteria, they evolve by this process of evolution by natural selection. So natural selection is the main, although not the only mechanism of evolution, but it is the mechanism that leads to the evolution of adaptations. And as we all know, the idea of natural selection being responsible for evolution was first proposed by Darwin in a book that he published 150 years ago, but also simultaneously a year before, another British biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, had come up with the same idea. And they both simultaneously presented this idea at a meeting of the Royal Society in 1958. But Darwin had done a whole of a lot more of work on this subject, and therefore he is better known for having come up with this idea. So how does evolution by natural selection work? The principle is relatively simple. You start out with a population in which there is variability in some trait. So in this case, we have some green and brown beetles. This trait may be associated with the probability of these individuals to survive and reproduce, or has to be associated in order for evolution by natural selection to happen. So in this case, we see that the green beetles stand out against a brown background, so they are more likely to be eaten by a predator, while the brown beetles escape predation and survive. So the coloration of these beetles is associated with the probability of survival and reproduction. The third thing that you need in order for evolution by natural selection to happen is for this trait to be based on some genetic characteristic of individuals. So the green or brown coloration is coded in the genes of these beetles. So as a result of this selective process that is happening here, in future generations, the brown beetles that are the ones that survive are the ones that are going to leave descendant offspring who are also going to be brown, so that we can go from a population that originally was half brown and half green to a population that is mostly brown in the future. This same principle of evolution by natural selection can be applied when we think about the evolution of antibiotic resistance, for instance. And we know that antibiotic resistance is a problem because it has increased in recent years. So this is a trend showing resistance in these bacteria that produce pneumonia. And we see that the bacteria strains resistant to a variety of antibiotics is increasing through time. So this, again, evolves in the same way as in the previous example. We have a population of bacteria that may have infected somebody, and there is going to be variability in that population. Some of these bacteria are going to, just by chance, have some mutation that makes them so that they are not affected by the antibiotic that we use to eliminate them. So after we apply the antibiotic, a lot of the bacteria are going to die, but a few of those who happen to be resistant to the antibiotic to some degree are going to survive. And then in a couple of generations, or just the next generation, we're going to have a new population of bacteria. But in this case, this population is going to be resistant. And this is why we need to be very aware of this situation when we are tempted to take antibiotics for whatever reason we are concerned about a cough or something like that. Because the problem of antibiotic resistance is a very general problem. First, it is a problem for the person who is undergoing the treatment, because the antibiotic is no longer going to be helpful for this person. It doesn't work anymore. But then the antibiotic-resistant bacteria that have evolved then may be transmitted to other people. So the treatment is also not going to work for other people in the population. But in bacteria, there is the additional problem that bacteria are able to transfer among each other these resistance factors. And that can happen even between bacteria that are not of the same type. So we may be taking an antibiotic that is causing resistance in a normal population of bacteria that live in our bodies. These are not pathogenic bacteria, but they have become resistant to antibiotics. And even though that may not affect us immediately, it may be that at some future point when we are infected by a pathogen that it is by a bacteria that is indeed pathogenic, then those bacteria may actually acquire these resistance factors from these bacteria that we have normally in our bodies, and then we have the problem of a pathogenic bacteria that we cannot treat with the antibiotic that we were trying to use.